Okay, our next category of important nutrients for our diet are our lipids. And so I'm going to ask you this question. Are we going to be using monomers, linking them together to make polymers for lipids? No, lipids are one of these molecules that do not use this system. So they do not use monomers and polymers. They do not use small molecules to link together to make bigger molecules. However, there are some things that they kind of have in common that are important to know about. And that is that they are what makes lipids all one category is that they are all hydrophobic, or at least partially hydrophobic. They have hydrophobic parts. Now, what does hydrophobic mean? Hydrophobic is relating to its ability to dissolve in water. Hydro, water, phobic, fearing. So hydrophobic molecules will not dissolve in water. Okay, so you think about if you mix oil and water together, the oil will separate out into its own layer because it will not dissolve in the water. All right, and that's true for all of these lipid molecules. Now, there are multiple types of lipids that we need to know about. We need to know about our first type, which is the fats, oils, and waxes. Okay, our fats, oils, and waxes is a large category, and within that category there are obviously three different types. Let's talk about the fats first. What makes this category all one thing is that they're all long chains of carbon. So maybe we should put that. All long chains of carbon. And oxygen and hydrogen. They're in there too, but what makes fats a little bit different is that they are solid at room temperature. And that goes back to their chemistry, and we'll look at their chemistry here in a minute to explain how that can be. So fats are solid at room temperature. They tend to be made by animals. Okay, so we get our fats from consuming animal products. And they're generally considered to be a less healthy alternative. We need to get lipids in our diet. It's important to have lipids, but if we can minimize the number of fats we consume, that's better in favor of getting more of the second category, which is our oils. So oils are liquid at room temperature. They are made by plants. And if you're going to get a lipid, which you have to get some lipids, these are considered the healthier option. It just relates to how our body processes these lipids is what makes them more or less healthy. Waxes, I'm not going to go a lot into waxes. Waxes are great for barriers. They're also solid at room temperature, but I really want you to pay more attention to the fats versus oils, especially when it relates to the dietary. Our second type of lipid are what we call phospholipids. These are smaller molecules. They have a little ring of carbons at one end, and then at the other end they have a couple chains of carbons, but they're shorter. And what makes phospholipids interesting is they're part hydrophobic and part hydrophilic. They have these two chains of carbons or carbon tails that are hydrophobic, so they will not dissolve in water. And they have a hydrophilic head that will associate well with water. And if it were on its own, it would dissolve in water. But it's attached to those hydrophobic tails, so in general, the molecules do not dissolve in water. Phospholipids are great for making barriers. I'm sorry, I'm running off my recording, aren't I? Let me get rid of some stuff here. So they're great at making barriers, and so our all cells use them for things like plasma membranes or cell membranes. Anywhere you need a membrane, it's going to be made up of phospholipids. Okay, so the third category is maybe one you don't know so much about because it's sort of an underappreciated category of lipids, and that is our steroids. Steroids include things like our own hormones. Okay, they're small carbon rings, they're small molecules. And they can also include things like our cholesterol. So important for function inside our body. The cholesterol that we consume in our diet is actually the precursor for making all of our hormones like testosterone and estrogen. So it's important that we get some cholesterol. Cholesterol is also used in our membranes to help make them more fluid. So do not underestimate the importance of cholesterol in our diet. The problem is a lot of us Americans get too much cholesterol. Okay, so let's take a look at these structures again. So I was telling you about these lipids. These are the fats and oils, and we're going to pay attention to the top two right now. So for example, we have saturated here on the top. These are our fats. They're called saturated, and I do encourage you to write this down. You need to know this. So next to fats, I want you to write saturated. And the reason they're saturated is because every carbon is bound either to another carbon or two hydrogens. So 2 carbons and 2 hydrogens. And so it forms this nice straight length of carbons. No kinks in this carbon chain. It's completely straight. Oils, on the other hand, which are liquid at room temperature, they do not bind to as many hydrogens. So they'll have a double bond between 2 carbons, and then each of those carbons is only bound to 1 hydrogen. And that creates this kind of bend or kink in the oil carbon chain. And so we call these unsaturated, okay, unsaturated oils. And because they're not saturated with hydrogens, all right? And so these are the healthier version for our diet, and this is what plants make. So animals make these saturated fats, and plants make these unsaturated oils. We'll get back to the trans down here in a minute. This is what our phospholipids look like. I told you that there was a little grouping of carbon up here at the head, and that is a hydrophilic head. So it does associate with water. And then we have these 2 chains of carbons that are hydrophilic, and so they do not associate with water. And that creates these great barriers that we're going to learn more about when we talk about membranes. And then finally, here are our steroids. The steroids are very simple, little carbon rings. Steroids include things like cholesterol and testosterone and estrogen, all right? And cholesterol tends to be the first, so it's what we eat, and then our body takes that cholesterol and turns it into these other hormones that our body needs. So it's important to get these to get some cholesterol in our diet. But like I said, we usually get too much. Okay, so speaking of diet, how much of our diet should be lipids? It's kind of a surprising amount. Right now, the FDA is recommending that 20 to 35% of our diet come from lipids. Now, not all lipids are the same, all right? Our diet needs to include mostly unsaturated oils, a little bit of cholesterol, and then minimizing the fats. So we're going to say 20 to 35% of our diet should be lipids, mostly the healthier unsaturated oils, and some little bit of cholesterol. And there's different forms of cholesterol. I'm spelling that wrong. I think I spelled that wrong earlier too. All right, there are different forms of cholesterol, and I encourage you to read up on that to learn more. Another important thing that we need to know when it comes to lipids relates to the idea of these hydrogenated oils. We need to avoid hydrogenated oils, or what they call trans fats. What these are is they are so everybody likes to spread something on their bread, right? We like that solidness that fat gives us. But we knew back in the 80s, 70s and 80s, that fats were not great for us. And so we came up with this new system where we could take oils, the nice unsaturated oils, and we could force them to have straight carbon chains. Instead of the kinks, I got the straight carbon chains. Well, the problem with that is that it doesn't really create a fat necessarily. It creates yet a different type of molecule, what that we call trans fats. They're solid at room temperature, like margarine, right, is solid at room temperature, but the problem is that it's not, our body doesn't know what to do with it, right? It's not something that our body is made to process because it's unnatural. And so it ends up that it causes things like heart disease and cancer and all sorts of bad things in our systems. As a matter of fact, we had a stick of margarine that we stuck in our lab, almost 25 years ago now, and it's still there because even microbes won't digest this stuff. They can't even survive it. So a lot of places have started passing laws to limit the number of trans fats or hydrogenated oils that can be in different things. And so we need to continue being aware as consumers to avoid these. This is what it looks like. So they took a unsaturated oil and they hydrogenated it. They used a chemical process that forced a bunch of hydrogens on it, which, yes, helped straighten out some of the kinks, but now we get these unusual kinks, which are a little bit different orientation than they should be, and we end up with these trans fats, and our body can't metabolize these. It's interesting that it can metabolize these because the hydrogens are on the same side here. Can't metabolize it if the hydrogens on the double bonds are on different sides. That doesn't work. So just another example of how shape determines function. All right, and that's it for fats. Let's move on to vitamins.